Okay, thank you, Joey. So as Joey introduced me, I have some a variety of backgrounds prior to academia, but the interesting parts of my academic career maybe started when we started doing this. So we had a behavior change and well-being research group in Helsinki University, which is now in Tampere University, with Nelly Hankonen as the team lead. And one of the projects we did was called Behavior Change Science and Policy, where we tried to bring together policymakers of different walks of life and also researchers from social psychology to sociology to psychology and political science and so forth. So that was quite an interesting mash of stuff, and we produced this sort of guidance for applying science and behavior change ideas in policy for the Finnish government. And then when the pandemic hit, I started two very interesting projects for me. So one of those was the Behavioral Science Advisory Group in the Prime Minister's office in Finland, and the other one was called Citizen Shield, which is currently in its end phase. So it's a project where we have a multidisciplinary collaboration, where we try to think, where we have a team of social psychologists trying to think about what makes people carry out pandemic protective actions. And then we have physicists, material scientists, and so forth, who study like how aerosols dissipate in a room, and what kinds of fabrics block viruses the best in masks, and so forth. And then we also have this behavior change science network in Finland, and I've also been part of a global citizens initiative called the World Health Network, led by someone you might know if you've been around complex system science for a while. So Janir Barjam was one of the founders, and so I've been part of the science and policy group of the network. So there are just some links. You'll find a ton of stuff on my website, including links for a recent course I did on for university students. So we've also been training civil servants in this. Oh, that was a very fast reaction, Joey. Yeah, so we've been training civil servants also, and hopefully we'll get to do more of that in the upcoming years too. What I'm going to talk about first is these two papers. The latter one is a preprint that I just posted last week, and the other one is in Health Psychology Review. It was the only paper that was of mine that was ever accepted without any changes, so it was an interesting journey in that sense. And well, I had many failures to publish in that journal before that about complex system stuff, but yeah, anyway. So we're going to talk about attractors a bit first, but in order to get there, something we need to discuss is how the magnitude of events does not necessarily mean the effects of events. And what I mean by that is, so here you have a sort of linear exposure profile. So you put on a little bit of effort and you get a little bit of results in return. Let me see if I can put on the point. Yeah. And then you put a little bit more effort and you get a bigger result, and a bit more effort and you get a bigger result. And in this sense, it's sort of rewarding, because you know that the more effort you put in, the bigger result you're going to get. But on the other hand, oftentimes in life, how things work is that you put on a little effort and nothing happens, and nothing happens, and you put in a little more, and nothing happens, and then you give up. And but those times you might not give up. Maybe at some point you get to this nonlinear curve where suddenly you put in a little effort and everything happens. So just a bit more, and stuff starts happening very, very rapidly. And this is very unintuitive when you think of it in terms of, so people have trouble planning their household finances because this is how interests in loans works, and it's also how pandemics tend to happen. It's really cheap to end a pandemic here, but it's politically not very rewarding. Whereas it's very rewarding. Everyone knows we have a problem here, but then it's already very, very expensive and difficult to act. So we sort of have another metaphor in a wide variety of cultures for the same phenomenon. So we have the straw that breaks a camel's back. You know, you load a straw to the camel's back, and you load another, and you load a third, and you're like, oh, nothing happens. So why not put 3 more, 1 more, 5 more, and so forth. And at some point, you put in 1 extra straw, and boom, the camel's back breaks. And then some social science emergency response unit comes to the scene with sirens blazing, and starts examining the last straw with a magnifying glass, and trying to figure out what were the special back-breaking capabilities of this last straw. And that's of course misguided, because it's the same straw as the others, but there was a threshold in the exposure profile. So nothing happened until everything happened at once. And then we can often call these things black swans if we didn't know it's going to happen. So black swans are coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his Inserto collection as these highly impactful events that are very difficult to foresee, but once they have happened, you can say that, oh yeah, it was obvious that this thing was going to happen. And it had a very huge impact, but so it's but still prospectively very few people knew what was going on. And pandemics are one of the worst kind. Some people call them actually gray swans, because we know that they are going to come, and we are going to have really, really bad ones. And historically, it's the same thing as with wars. They have a distribution where most of them don't cause almost any damage. So like most wars, most pandemics, they kill like in the thousands, a few thousands. But then we have like, for example, 1 in 100 pandemics that would kill more than a billion people, which and 1 in 100 is not really that extremely rare if you think of it. But so I want to talk about these tipping points. So some of you may know what tipping point is, but and I will soon show the conventional picture. But here you have a time series of the proportion of Finnish population who report wearing a mask most or all of the time in public spaces. So we start from 2020, and the time series ends in 2022. And so here we have a very low mask uptake. And if you would think that the future will be just like the past, you would maybe think that it will, or predict that it will happen. It will take this course of the dotted line here. But what actually happened was that there was first a small uptick, and then around 25%, there was a huge uptick in the uptake of masks, and then it sort of ended in a fluctuating state with some details that we can talk about later if you want. But so this gap here is the gap between business as usual and something very novel actually taking place. So many of the health officials were expecting this route to take place, so they weren't even considering the how masks could be actually taken part of as a part of the public health and social measures palette in the early on in the pandemic. And so this is a fun study. It's quite a clever study, and they are not talking about this 24% being a universal tipping point, but they had this experimental setup where they put in dissenters in discussion groups, and when the number of dissenters reached a particular threshold, the whole group tipped their opinion and changed their mind to doing something differently. So we can think of this as a tipping point because it's a point between two sort of valleys. And this is how it's usually presented. So we have two valleys. These valleys are sort of called attractors, which consist of a number of similar states. So we could have here an attractor of low to no mask wearing, and here an attractor of high mask wearing. And so if this ball starts moving in this valley, you might not see much change, and if you push it uphill, it might roll back. And but then if you push it here up to this on top of this hill, and then it might be that it starts going around the other side, and then suddenly a lot would be starting to happen in a very short time, and it could then eventually ease back into this new attractor, so where we have a lot of mask wearing around. And that's sort of the basic idea, but there are sort of there's more to it than just the ball being kicked uphill and ending up in this other attractor. Because another way of thinking about it is that actually the landscape itself can move. So one of the attractors can suddenly become destabilized more and more until the ball actually finds itself sitting on top of a tipping point, at which point it very naturally, even a small push can push it back to the other attractor. And so here are the two ways of these sort of critical transitions can take place. So this is what I just showed. So the landscape itself changes and ends up pushing the ball to a new attractor. Or we can have a situation where one of these black swans, for example, boom, kicks the ball to this novel attractor. But if it remains quite shallow, it's easy for random events to push it back here. And in real change processes, what you see is a combination of these two forces. So we have, so this is called bifurcation-induced tipping, or B-tipping, and this is called noise-induced tipping, or N-tipping. And I'm hearing that Joey is having a paper about B-tipping, so keep your eyes open for seeing. And I can't enough recommend this interactive demonstration. So this is by a guy called someone called Nicky Case, and it is a very, very nice introduction to attractor landscapes, and it's only 5 minutes, and it has these all of these nice elements that you can move, and if you're watching the video, then I really suggest you pausing it for 5 minutes now and having a look at this link. So let me move on to something related, because this is sort of the next evolution. So here what I showed you is an attractor landscape of 2 valleys. So we had 2 attractors and a tipping point in the middle of them. But so there is this field guide called Managing Complexity and Chaos in Times of Crisis, first authored by Dave Snowden in 2021. And if you're in EU, they will actually post this for you, the physical copy for free. But you can also download it for free. The PDF is a bit messy, but anyway. And so I'm going to talk about some of the ideas contained here. And these are ideas much publicized by Dave Snowden, who is a very productive person in the field of applied complexity. So this is one of his quite comprehensive recent talks that I might suggest if you have an hour or hour and a half to check it out. So what I'm going to talk about is basically a space of possibilities. So this paper, this is from this new one, the preprint I showed you, where we talk about a space of possibilities which contains sort of so each of these tiles is one state. So this state could be, so if this would be sort of the whole of humanity's current pandemic, public health situation with regard to pandemics, and we would have one tile here, which would be low to moderate precautions and a highly contagious variant or set of variants of a novel pathogen running around. So we could have another step here, or a state that would be the extended distribution and uptake of a pan-variant vaccine, for example. That would represent a different state to the one that we currently have. We could have a more distant state, which could be a highly deadly variant arising from humans infecting deer or something, and then the infections in the deer mutating into something highly deadly and then transmitting back to humans. And then we could have a really bad scenario here, like the rise of tohu. And so each of these tiles could represent one particular state of the world. And from this landscape, we can then think of different, we could have certain archetypal scenarios with attractors in it. So we could have an attractor landscape where you have one very deep and stable attractor. And in the paper, we present this we present 4 different scenarios, and these also come with sort of these contextual decision-making principles. So if you are in a very stable situation where the pool of the current attractor is very strong, and well, then like past is a very good indicator of the future, which means that you can actually take your past practices and stuff that you do well and start optimizing that stuff. And do what you did before, but do it better in order to succeed. So you want to exploit current opportunities because there are very few novel ones coming around. But you need to also monitor the landscape for changes, because if you only focus on optimization, then you're in trouble if the situation changes and what you optimize for doesn't work anymore. So one of these situations could be sort of a situation where you have two attractors here. And in the middle, we have a tipping point or a tipping ridge, maybe in this sense. So you have a very deep attractor here, but it can also you can get freed with an end-tipping process. So maybe a black swan or whatever kicks you out of the attractor, and then you end up in this attractor where sort of different laws hold and different paradigms produce good results. So you need to be cautious of what happens. And if these attractors or if this landscape is already also in a flux, so it's changing all the time, then you need to be constantly exploring around you and adapting to the different situations, keeping your options open, so managing optionality, and continuously accepting, so repurposing your existing tools into new combinations and innovating in that sense. And then thirdly, you could have a situation where you have a very bad scenario here. So we call this a ruin state. So a ruin in insurance and probability, it refers to a state that you don't come back from. So it could be bankruptcy or death, but in the case of pandemics, it could be sort of a very highly contagious pathogen causing the extinction of most of humanity, for example. And it's not, it's actually less far out as you might imagine. I refer you to Barjam and Roth, 2008. There's a paper which showed that this extinction threshold very rapidly arrives once you increase flight travel across continents. But so the thing is that you might dwell on this attractor for a very long time, and there might be people saying that, yeah, we need to build this ridge higher and mitigate this threat, but that's not very politically very appealing, because hey, nothing's happened in 50 years, in 100 years, and so why should we worry about that? Maybe it's a thing of the past. And but the thing is that unless this attractor is really one that has trapped you forever, then all your potential, one of your potential futures will eventually lead to this ruin state. So as long as there is a ruin state that's accessible, you will eventually reach it. And it's also it causes something called non-ergodicity to happen. We won't go into that. But still, the main contextual principle for managing such an attractor landscape would be cutting the downside, so mitigating the risk of ruin state as well as you can, because you can't thrive unless you live. So that's another case here. But the thing is that in reality, we have science that can tell us what the consequences of different actions are, and maybe some evolutionary pathways that are open. But we don't have this extended foresight where we know what every tile contains. So we have this sort of a fog of war almost that covers all the tiles, but the main adjacent ones. And so we call these the adjacent possibles. So this is a term by Stuart Kaufman. And so we have, so let's say, let's play that here is the ruin state. We don't want to go there. We don't want to, so for example, if we're here, we don't want to figure out how close to the edge we are able to stay and still play, because eventually there will be a random event that will push us towards the ruin attractor, and then we're dead. So we know that we want away from the ruin. And then we have these other states here that we can maybe choose to evolve towards. And I put this red barrier here to show that, okay, so these tiles are not accessible today, but maybe if we went to 3, then maybe 4 would become available to us. And this would be a strategy called, we have a term called obliquity, which is like this indirect solution of problems. That's very important often, because if we have a lot of uncertainty and we have a lot of changes going on in the attractor landscape, it might not be that we could just take up some very ideal scenario and start very rationally building towards that, but we might need to actually change the landscape in many different ways, and then find that, oh, actually here is a path. So it's sort of like you're traveling in a forest and trying to find your way and seeing what paths open, instead of having a map that you can actually be sure guides you to the right place. And so this is the background idea to many of these things that I'm going to now talk about. So one of the most important things here now is to think about the evolutionary potential of the present, as Dave Snowden puts it. So we want to know where we are, and not that much oftentimes what kind of an utopia we would like to have. And we want to make the unattractive things more difficult to reach, and good states more easy to reach. And so I'm going to talk about the project I did for my hometown. And so first of all, many places are not really equipped to talk to someone about complexity, and I would really suggest not doing that, because it is a really rough path. But there might be adjacent possible ways to get these ideas through without actually which can be very, very idiographic, so to say, and idiosyncratic to different localities. So basically what I did was that we had this survey, and people wanted to know more about how to get the citizens' voices heard, and how to improve safety and participation in the town. And so there's one of the stories I often recount is that there was this high-level manager who I had coffee with, and he was new in town, and I asked him, well, he asked me this weird question, which was like, okay, so where do we need citizen engagement practices if people have already had their chance to vote the people they wanted to the office? And this was a weird question because I thought it was obvious to everyone that people who have more ownership of their living environments, that they vandalize the common property less, they use less mental health services, they have greater social safety nets and so forth. So I felt a bit uncertain about the future of citizen engagement practices with this sort of a new attitude in town. But it turned out quite nicely. The thing was that what I started doing with them, with the citizen engagement team, was something called was taking the first steps toward a micro-narrative approach. And this is an approach developed by Dave Snowden in different action research contexts. And so I will show you what the process looks like, but basically it's a form of not having intense qualitative data as in interviews, and not having intense numerical data as in traditional surveys. And the traditional surveys have this problem that if you ask people like how safe do you feel around your neighborhood, and they answer 3, and you get an average of 3.4, and then the next year you get the average rises to 3.6, or it goes down to 3.2, and then you're like, then someone from the management team is asking you, hey, so what happened? And you're like, well, the average went down, but why? Well, maybe many different reasons. And so it sort of puts you in this bind because you don't know the context of the numbers. And this can be used for different sense-making and stakeholder engagement practices, as well as research, but I'll just show you how it works. So basically, in a traditional survey, you have some sort of an event that you query about. So, well, it doesn't necessarily need to be a specific event, but a certain topic. And people, every person has their experience of the event or the topic. And then you ask them to put in their experiences in numerical form, maybe open questions also in this traditional survey responses. But what you also have these people do is that these people have these different stories about stuff they encountered in this in their daily lives, for example, or regarding an event. And these they share different fragments of this experience with their neighbors and their loved ones and their peers. And then like I tell a story, you hear me tell a story, and then you tell the story to someone else. And then the story sort of starts living almost like it's an entity of its own. And so this story also then starts sort of drawing us, if it's a compelling story, it can draw us like an attractor into these ways of thinking and perceiving the world. So for example, in here we have, someone built, before I moved in here, someone built the world's largest Finnish flagpole or something like this. And so it was a huge flagpole. And when I came in, I thought, oh, that looks pretty cool. But then people around here, they had been hearing the political debate, and so how this is this construction project, it's a something for the politicians' egos and so forth, and then you start really feeling bad about the flagpole, and every time you see it and you can't not see it, you start feeling this animosity towards the politicians and so forth. But it's not, it's a flagpole. It doesn't in itself contain these different meanings and all of that stuff. But those meanings and those stories really put on a lot of weight when we start talking about them and spreading these ideas. Well, so what we want people to do in this micronarrative survey is that we want them to share these fragments that they would tell their neighbors or peers. And everyone has their own fragments. They're not going to tell you everyone, but hopefully they will share some they consider important. So, for example, we asked if someone new moved to the area around you, what kind of an experience or a tip about living in that area would you give them? And this gave us really interesting data, and also we asked people what is the biggest threat or an opportunity that you see this municipality facing in the future, and you get a lot of coverage, different perspectives and different views from asking such open questions, and then you can index them, have people self-index them with these more traditional survey questions. So the thing was that we had 700 people or 750 people doing responding to our survey, which was a hybrid of a traditional survey and a micronarrative survey. And my problem was that I was given 45 minutes in front of the management team to explain the data that was so this 700 people responding to many questions, and also producing over 4,000 open-ended responses to different open-ended questions, some of which had this micro-narrative form. And no one in the management team has really human data analysis expertise, so I need to be very clear. And so I pondered this for a long time, like, what do I do? Because one of the premises of complexity is that you as one person have very limited amount of knowledge about anything, basically. And so that's why you need these diverse perspectives, and you need to hear many of them. And but the thing is that the knee-jerk response often for a decision maker is that, hey, tell me what the data said. What should we do? And the problem is that if you're doing a development project, for example, like I was, and I'm not a city official. I'm not. I don't know the contexts where these particular people live and what they complain about. But we have people in the management team who are actually experts in this stuff. But they want. So what I told them was that. I can make this data a dish. I can make it a nice palatable dish, but it does not make any sense for me to chew your dish and then present it to you with all my biases and my very limited knowledge about the hyperlocal conditions and what you know about what you can do about different stuff. So what I did was, I'm going to now change the screen. I'm sharing. To this one. So what I did was I made I clustered the data. Let's see. Into different groups. We can talk more about how I did this, but it's not too important for now. So I showed them sort of basically this visualization. So you're most interested about these people who are the least satisfied. We have an interesting cluster here because these are the most satisfied people. And then we have these people who are basically quite satisfied, but they feel very little involvement in their surroundings and the sense of community. So on the vertical axis, you have ability to influence town matters and their something they related about threat to a sense of community. And here we have safety, well-being, and considering the town is enjoyable. And I showed them this. There are a couple of more clusters of people too, but we don't need to worry about those right now. So I showed them because they usually had to work with age groups, and I showed them that. So if I make the colors based on age, we have all these different age groups, and they don't really cluster very nicely with these compared to the attitudes. And so the point here was that these people, so we have a lot of data, but we can sort of simplify it by making it into these clusters. But there's still a lot of data, but we can already see that for these people here, there is an adjacent possible, perhaps, that is up here. So maybe we can move these people, look at what stories these people tell, what sort of open-ended responses they tell, and try to make them tell more, or think about how do we make these people tell more stories like these people. And then we have so we have, for example, these blue special cases. So how do we make these people here, for example, how do we make them tell less stories like these people tell, and more stories like these people tell? And it's a sort of an indirect way, because you don't need to go to your sub-managers or something like this and tell them, okay, so how do we make the city more nicer to live in? And one example that Dave Snowden talks about is if you go to nurses and tell them how do you become more patient-centric, they get defensive. But then if you tell them like, okay, so how do we get more patient stories like this and less patient stories like that, it's very intuitive to work with it. And so each of these dots contained a bunch of open-ended responses, and I showed them, no, these are redacted, but so what I showed them was that, okay, so we have a lot of data. We only have 45 minutes in total because you didn't give me any more time. So what we're going to do is, so what I did was I put each of these cluster, I anonymized the data, and I fed the data into artificial intelligence, and I had the AI produce a collective story that was quite a short, just one paragraph. So I had these 7 stories created from the open-ended responses of each of the interesting clusters for the management team. So I had a positive and a negative story for them for each of the clusters. And then I had them go around and think, okay, so choose one of these stories that you think is important, and let's discuss how do you get more of those stories or less of them if it's a negative story. And so that worked like really well, and it sort of gives you the sense of the adjacent possible, like what is the evolutionary potential of the present when you listen to them have these conversations about, okay, so what's to be done. And all of these different groups, they have their adjacent areas where you could maybe try and move them. So that's like one very elementary thing to view viewing this sort of a two-dimensional grid, almost like a map of the attractor landscape. There are some caveats to this, but it's something that can make sense to people who are not really versed in complex systems sciences. And maybe I just end up with talking about these tipping points, just that the idea that you never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, was the quote from Margaret Mead. And then we have another one from Scott E. Page, who says that all it takes is a few angry people and a lot of positive feedback. So you also want to collect these stories and these sort of tacit signals that are very that can be outside the mean or the mainstream, and catch them early before they turn into huge fires. I won't go into this, but we also did for the Finnish government, we looked at these different pandemic precautions, and we looked at, okay, so how do people perceive them, how easy or difficult and how ineffective or effective they think of them. And then we gave recommendations so that, okay, so for example, people think that ventilation and air purification is easy, but it's hugely ineffective because nobody really knew about aerosol transmission. And so we recommended that you should try and make it easier for people to understand how effective this is, for example, and make home tests both easier and perceived as more effective, and so forth. So you can have this the adjacent possibles, and some of these ideas, some of these precautions were already in the right place, but that didn't stop people from getting rid of them. But yeah. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation, and also seeing the different ways that we can conceive of how to communicate some of the ways that some of the theories and the processes and the methodologies that we use to others. And now we'll have a short question answer session. If you have questions, you can either take yourself off mute, put your question in the chat. I'll get started because this thing I've been holding on to for a while now. Many of us here, or all of us here, work in the field of education research, and I'm wondering a lot about this question of how to communicate to others. So for many of us who either use interventions, or we have stakeholders who want to know, well, when will we see the effect? I'm curious if there's a way, and I popped in the chat, to either anticipate a threshold, or just how do you communicate to someone the thing you want to see may not come linearly as many people suggest, but maybe you got to wait for a little bit of time till it all happens at once.
Yeah, that's also that's an interesting question, because sometimes it's difficult for people to see that we have these things that affect the issue that we're dealing with. So, for example, educational achievement of youth, and we could. So there's this method called estuarine mapping, which, for example, it maps all these things that affect the issue that we're dealing with. But once you have mapped all the different issues, you can draw a systems map if you want, but it can get quite cluttered with a lot of people and ideas. But the thing is that some of those things you can change. Some of those things you can't change. And some of those things you can change after something else happens. Some of those things you might not be able to change, but you can sort of do something to make them easier to change in the future. And so you have these sort of many different things. So it's not only let's act to remove this barrier, or let's act to enforce this good thing, but you might actually also want to think about, okay, so let's put a monitor here, let's monitor this, and if it changes, then we grab it. And you can also think, if you think of it in the attractor landscape idea, you can sort of how do we make the mountain pass where we can walk towards this state more easily? So that's also like an interesting way of thinking about it.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Take yourself off mute, Hande. Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. This was really useful. I have a question. I got stuck with ruin state. Mm-hmm. And how this may apply to educational contexts. Would that mean that, for example, in an educational context, would that mean that no matter how good or how professional the intervention is, it is impossible to perturb the system to get out of that ruin state, no matter what we do? Does that mean that? Can you elaborate a little bit on this? Because that's pretty...
Yeah, I wonder if you have ruin states in education. For example, for a private school, a ruin state could be using all your funds and getting bankrupt, or maybe a sex scandal or something like this that sort of put you out of business forever. But that would be just for a single school. I think if you would have a school system, then you would probably have the government prevent you from getting completely destroyed. So I kind of struggled to think about what could be a good example in education, or in a systemic way. Maybe there are none. I don't know. But as long as we have the government bailing stuff out, maybe large corporations don't have either.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it's a good area for us to think about. I appreciate it.
While there's a pause, feel free to keep thinking of questions. Matti, I have actually another question for you. Have you ever used the attractor landscape to talk to stakeholders who are unfamiliar with complexity theory, or do you find that visual is too complicated and confusing?
It depends. So, for example, if you have, I think it can be a very nice example for. Well, let me put it like this. So we had this. We had over 100 civil servants in our training, and we used the attractor landscape sort of as a metaphor and to think about risk management, and to drive home the point that even though something hasn't happened for a very long time, it doesn't mean that the system can't switch its state, and the switch is not necessarily continuous. It can be very abrupt. And there were some people who thought that, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then there was one person who, so we had these 6-month post session interviews, and they said that yeah, I've been talking about this to every person I meet. It has like completely changed my world. And so there is a lot of variability, and I hope someone will come up with ways to explain it in a more in better ways. We have some ideas that we're working on, but I think it also needs yeah, you can probably make it more understandable if you take into account the listener a bit more. But if you have 100 people from all the different sectors, then it can be quite difficult.
Thank you. And with our remaining minute, Xavier, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you so much, Matti, for your presentation. I assume you're familiar with the leverage points theory, dating back to Donella Meadows' classic work on complex systems thinking. Do you see a relationship between leverage points and trying to change a system and your work on attractors? In other words, when we're doing leverage points, are we changing the existing attractor, or are we creating a new attractor from which we're trying to push people up the hill and into the new attractor? Love your thoughts on that.
I think a leverage point could be conceived as a way to shift from one state to the next, not going too much uphill first, but actually finding this some angle that makes you find a path to the new state. My problem with leverage point thinking is that I find the idea very compelling, and there's a reason why it's been all over the place for the last 50 years or something. But I haven't really seen very compelling applications that would put it to real life practice, and that's something I've been sort of sad about over the years, that it's whereas this like Desnoden's ideas about the evolutionary potential of the present, you can make it very concrete and sort of understand how these complex systems have the fuzzy boundaries, and you can find these evolutionary pathways around and all of that. But so I'm curious if someone knows a catchy real world example of leverage points that isn't retrospective, because in retrospect you can always say that, oh yeah, well, this was a leverage point because we did this small thing and it changed everything. But prospectively it can be a bit more difficult.
Thank you.
Well, with that, I want to first thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Matti, so much for your presentation. I'm going to wrap us up for today. So first, thank you again, Matti, and please everyone join me in thanking Matti for his presentation. Great job. Really, really appreciate everything. Our next how-to webinar will feature Dr. Joanna Gardner discussing how to apply for grants, and you can register for that event. I'm going to drop the registration link in the chat. It's also on your screen. If you have any questions, you can always email us. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Matti, once again for your amazing presentation. Everyone have a great rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you all very soon.
Thanks for attending, everyone. Have a good one.